at the role of leadership in crisis and beyond, and look at some of the impacts that happen to business when they're ill prepared for crisis, and also where businesses fail to adopt, change, and transform adequately. During this session, if you can keep your microphones on mute and webcams also off. At the latter part of the session, we'll have an open mic discussion. If for any reason you don't want to put your questions over the microphone, please just type them into the chat function and I'll look at those as we go along and I'll try and capture them for you. So leaders, when we think about leaders of businesses, there's different types of leaders, and we'll look at some of those aspects in the spectrum of leadership in a little while. From my side of things, I've worked with some very inspiring leaders who work for the overall good of the organization, and I've worked with some leaders who have been very autocratic and very focused on their own personal development and their own targets rather than looking at the overall aspect of a business. And so from this side of things, I want us to have a bit of a discussion at the end, talking about which styles of leadership you feel are the right style, and whether there is a one particular style that works better in an organization. From my experience, I have seen different types of leaderships in styles within different organizations. So what is leadership? We think about leadership, there is the leadership spectrum. And the leadership spectrum goes from laissez-faire, which is very much hands-off, not inspiring, and only works in very limited types of organizations, all the way through to autocratic style, which is do what I say. And then in between that, we have various other aspects. Affiliative is where we see that leaders are focused on their people. Pace setting, do what I do. So if we think of Elon Musk, he is a pace setter. He's setting the pace. He's telling everyone, I work longer, I work harder. Now, that particular type of style can be helpful, but it can lead to people burning out within the organization, and it's not for everyone. Democratic is where we're trying to get consensus, and we're speaking to people and empowering people, but at the same time we're trying to move forward together. And then authoritative, where we're showing and leading by example, showing the way. And so we think about leadership, there's all these different styles, and there's been hundreds and hundreds of books written about leadership and effective leadership. But ultimately, when we think about leadership, there's different styles, and it may be that we have to adapt as we go along the way. And so I put together some of my thoughts on what are some of the core leadership dimensions that we would be thinking of as we develop ourselves and also our teams. Things that we need to have in our war chest, things that we have to have available to enable us to be able to act quickly and be able to make the right decisions. We need to be strategy focused, looking at today, learning from the past, but also looking towards the future. Generally, strategy is set for 3 or 5 years, but the reality is that in this particular period of COVID-19, and also with the whole aspect of digitalization and automation, what we're seeing is that strategy is having to evolve and change. Obviously, you have vision, mission, and also the business objectives, which are based on your core values. But your mission is tied to your strategy. Your strategy helps you perform your mission towards the long-term vision of the organization. Then we think about risk management oversight. Leaders need to consider risk. Why is that important? Well, if we don't know that a storm is coming, we will not be prepared for a storm. Many businesses were not prepared for COVID-19. Very few people had even considered that there would be a world pandemic that would have a massive knock-on effect, not just on travel, but on all aspects of business. And we're seeing some of the effects now on hotels and leisure and transportation, but we're also seeing the slow knock-on effect of that because businesses have had to downsize. We've seen in the UK, they put a stimulus package in place to try and support and keep people employed. They allowed for staff to be furloughed and to receive 80% of their pay, up to £2,500 per month. And so that gave businesses the opportunity to use some of the government funding to allow businesses to keep employing people. And so the government tried to act quickly in the UK when it came to putting together economic stimulus, and they gave other benefits such as delaying when businesses needed to file tax and pay VAT and other aspects. Culture is a very important aspect of leadership, and setting the culture of a company really ties in to the whole aspect of strategy, culture, and governance, and effective management of an organization. If we don't manage culture, culture will manage us. It will rise up if we're not setting the direction. Peter Drucker mentioned that culture eats strategy for breakfast. I go further and say that it eats strategy for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and it has an insatiable hunger. And so we have to control and focus on strategy. Most of the aspects of culture are all tied to people, and people are the ones that either are behaving correctly or incorrectly or inappropriately. And so we have to set the cultural tone with respect to behaviors. Of course, as a leader of an organization, we have to meet and achieve our business objectives. We're being considered on an annual basis. If we're a CEO, the board are expecting us to deliver on the strategy that has been formed at the board level. Tone from the top. We want leaders to tell us and show us the way. How are we to behave? What are the right behaviors within the organization? Is there equality? Is there diversity? Is there investment in not just the management team and the leadership team, but is there investment towards employees? And there's various case studies that have been put. There was a cab company in Singapore who invested in teaching the taxi drivers how to speak English, and most of the taxi drivers were middle-aged or older, and they said, why do we need to speak English? And the company explained that by speaking English, it enhances your opportunity for further development, but also to engage with your customers and to take more customers. Because if your customers are traveling and trying to take a taxi and you don't speak good English, then it's going to limit your ability to be able to service those particular customers. And long story short, that particular organization invested in their people, and they got buy-in from some of the top people within the various sections within the organization, and those people were advocates for change. And so the company paid for English classes. What then transpired was many of the people who had taken the step to try and learn a new language found that they were also inspired to take further learnings that they paid for themselves outside of work to try and enhance their own knowledge and experience. And so sometimes within the workplace, if we can inspire and support and train and develop our employees, then we see that that has a knock-on effect. The majority of people will want to do more. And also it's a way of engaging with staff. Employee engagement and customer satisfaction are intrinsically linked. Leaders need to be agile and be able to put in place innovative thinking and design. They need to know what's happening in the currently, what's happening within their peers, and also what's happening outside in the wider macro environment. Of course, a leader should have empathy towards the other leadership team and also to employees. Have a caring heart, do the right thing for the right reasons, but at the same time, they need to be aware of where they are lacking. Is there a perfect leader? I would hazard to say that I've never seen a 100% perfect leader. Leaders do make mistakes, but where a leader is self-aware and they have self-awareness, one of the things that they're able to do is to improve and develop and try and fill the gaps within their own arsenal of competencies and skills, but also bring in other people who will help and support them. An organization in some ways is actually fettered by the aptitude and the thinking of the leadership, because if the leadership are not open to change, not open to new ways of doing things, then as an organization, quite often creativity and innovation are stifled. And this is where coaching and mentoring come into play. Leaders should be developing future leaders, working with the next tier down, and we should be encouraging within our organization and in organizations worldwide that there is a function and ability that people can take on the role of either coaching and asking people, what do you think, and trying to get them to think for themselves, or by mentoring and guiding people through step by step. And both approaches should be there in our arsenal as leaders. The thing about leadership is that we have to make decisions. We cannot approach things in a way that we will say that we come back later, we'll make a decision in a week's time or a month's time. In these times of crisis, what we see, we can't defer a decision. Decisions need to be made, and how do we make effective decisions? If we're a board of directors, then we're expecting board information and packs to be coming to us in a timely manner that are correct and are easily understood. And we have to have one view of the truth. When we think about risk management and risk oversight, one view of the truth is required. And when we look at enterprise risk management, we'll be looking at one in another session. We'll be deep diving into some of the aspects of how we embed the understanding of authority and power and responsibility and accountability, and also reward and penalization for not following what is set by the organization. And finally, we have to inspire. People follow us for various reasons, but the best reason to be having followers is because that we have inspired them, giving them some form of hope and allowed them to develop their thinking. And so inspirational leaders will focus on trying to develop and enhance the workforce and the employees within the organization, and try and get people to strive and stretch their goals so that they are on an ongoing basis developing and growing. So a proactive leadership approach in crisis and beyond. During a crisis, sometimes the leadership style and approach has to change. We have to go, if maybe we were more democratic, we may have to model the way or become very autocratic, knowing that we need to make quick decisions and move quickly. In one of my previous trainings, I mentioned that if we are laissez-faire or if we are democratic and we're in a building and the fire alarm goes off and there's an actual physical fire, we can't get consensus and try and coach people. We can't be laissez-faire and say, well, if you want to stay, we need a leader that will tell us there is a fire, we need to leave the building, this is the way to leave the building safely, follow me and let's get going. And so crisis brings out sometimes the best and the worst within organizations. It's during these times that we are seeing that many businesses didn't have the processes and systems and policies and procedures in place to allow working from home. And so many businesses have had to adopt a new way of doing business over the last few months. Even Governance Gurus has had to approach. Most of our training used to be by face-to-face or in-house training or in conferences and masterclasses, but we've now moved to a digital platform. We also train students for the ICSA, the Chartered Governance Institute of the UK. And so we've been having training sessions by webinar over a period of 2.5 or 3 hours, depending on the text that we're looking at. So having the right approach is very important, and we have to think in the long term. What we do today will either impact the business significantly or have a reputational aspect to it. So by organizations in the UK, and I mentioned the UK again, I'm actually hosting this webinar in the UAE, but in the UK, many businesses took the opportunity to use the government funding. Many large businesses, including some of the football clubs, they put some of the lower paid staff onto the furlough or onto the government scheme, but they were still paying the players huge salaries. And so there's an ethical dilemma as well. Sometimes legally we're allowed to do something, but ethically, as larger organizations, should we be doing that thing? So in crisis, we see that people then start to focus on other aspects. There's sometimes knee-jerk reactions, wrong decisions are made because people are focused on firefighting. And that's why it's important for, number one, to plan for the future, number two, to have business continuity management and planning, and also disaster recovery. And so from these side of things, it's important that businesses are agile and adaptable. In this region, many of the law firms have gone to either a hybrid model or they have gone to a working from home model. Other businesses have done the same, but there's certain industries where people have to go into the office, into the factory and do work. And when they do, we have to make sure that people have the right protective equipment, personal protective equipment, and that we've got policies and procedures in place to ensure that people understand what's expected of them, and also what we're doing from a fiduciary side to ensure the safety and well-being of employees. So I want to focus on sometimes the impact of making the wrong decisions can have on a business, and I use Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo is a case study that I have touched on in a number of trainings over the last few years. But I've chosen Wells Fargo because even this year we have seen impacts of some of the governance failings within Wells Fargo that are still having an impact on that company as we speak. So in 2016, Wells Fargo agreed to pay 185 million as a settlement fee or charge because of the practices of setting up false accounts or fake accounts or client accounts without their knowledge. And there was a long process drawn out where this had happened over a number of years, from the early 2000s all the way through to 2016. So this is a long period. It's now transpired that it was more than 2 million accounts. It was actually closer to 3.5 million accounts. And so that's setting up bank accounts, putting people into the wrong types of products, and also having customers update their information and inadvertently sign to open up a credit card or a savings account where you have to have a minimum balance, and if you don't have the minimum balance, you're then penalized by a high fee. Based on what had happened, the chairman and CEO, one and the same person, John Stump, resigned over what had happened with the employee past practices of secretly selling services to customers. And there were various committees, two main committees, one where Elizabeth Warren was talking and asking John Stump about his aggressive style to try and grow the company, and she used the words that he had given to investors on investor calls, talking about 8 is great, that his focus was on cross-selling, aggressive cross-selling, and that he wanted the business to encourage and try and develop 8 customer accounts for each client of theirs. And so over the years, as the cross-selling took place, then Wall Street and investors started investing heavily into Wells Fargo, and the share price increased. During that period of the actual fake account and other scandals, John Stump's share or stock price increased by around 200 million. So he could have paid the fine for Wells Fargo and still had change in his pocket of 15 million. And that's outside of his other remuneration. So in December 2016, we then saw that regulators started focusing on Wells Fargo, and they wanted to understand if they had to unwind, if there was a bankruptcy, did they have the appropriate mechanism in place and living will, as they call it, to test whether or not that business would be able to manage the various aspects. Then 2 years later, we see that the Federal Reserve also restricted the growth of the bank due to customer abuses and compliance breakdowns. And these breakdowns didn't happen overnight. They were happening over a prolonged period of time. 2018, Wells Fargo had to settle and pay for their part in mortgage locks and auto loan issues in providing insurance to people for auto loans where they already had insurance in place. Then again, the investors were suing Wells Fargo for getting misleading information in regards to the 8 is great and the things, and there was a settlement there of 480 million. The story goes on. Wells Fargo then had to pay 2.1 million for the allegations regarding improper represented mortgages as sold to investors during the boom. Also, we saw that some of the advisors, there was an investigation, and SEC looked at over 70 advisors and saw that Wells Fargo was one of those advisors that were selling products to customers in order to get higher commissions and fees for the advisor themselves. And the story continues. Back in January of this year, John Stumpf was personally fined 17.5 million. And at the time, that was the highest individual fine given to an individual based on a breakdown of internal controls and for leading a business. But 7 other executives were also fined, and the largest fine actually went to Carrie Tolstead for her part in regards to the compliance aspects and lack of internal controls. But the story didn't end there. In February, the Department of Justice and the Securities Exchange Commission also fined Wells Fargo $3 billion. So over a course of time, Wells Fargo have suffered paying out many fines, but the actual money they have made is more than the money that they have been fined. And I think when we think about enforcement and leadership, leaders will either do the right thing for the right reason, or if there's no boundaries and no controls, the opportunity for them to commit fraud or to coerce or provide unrealistic targets is there in order for them to get a bonus. And so this is the stock price or the share price for Wells Fargo from 2000 all the way to current day. And as you can see, the share price has increased, and at one point up to over $65. And if we look at the aspect, we see during the period of the scandal, the share price continued to rise. Here we had the financial crisis, so most stock dropped, and then we see a period of high growth from the bank. In 2013 to 15, 5,000 customers complained that they had not consented for accounts or credit cards or saving accounts to be set up in their name. But you can see from the share price, because of the performance and what was represented to the market and the financial statements and annual report that were given publicly, the share price continued to grow from 2013 all the way to 2015. And we see the share price continue to grow all the way through into the point in 2016 where the fraud was discovered regarding the fake account scandals. And then the share prices fluctuate. There's been a change in regards to the leadership within Wells Fargo. There's been various earnings and they've been able to make profit. But again, we've seen spikes hitting there, and now we see a complete drop-off of where the bank is today. So that's why governance is important for leaders. And the Chartered Governance Institute, formerly known as ICSA, this is their definition of corporate governance. It's referred to in the way that companies are governed or controlled or led, and to what purpose? What is the vision and the purpose of the organization? What was it there for? Banks are there for developing trust for customers so that people put the money in the bank. And one of the things that came out of the Wells Fargo failings was that they had to try and renew trust. And so when we think of prevention or cure, it's better or it's cheaper to prevent than to cure. And for John Stump, in the short term, it was a benefit to him. But if we look today, he's been banned for life working in financial services. He was fined. I don't think it was a big enough fine, but he was fined nevertheless. And that this is a step forward. We are seeing now that the authorities and regulators are starting to personally hold directors and leaders to account for not doing the right thing and not directing people in the right direction. And so corporate culture is very important. When we look at governance as well, it's not just the processes, but it's also how this is driven through the company's objectives. And also we have to look at the context of our strategy and our leadership, what is happening socially in the regulatory environment, but also in the market environment. And it's never more so important than today. But ultimately, businesses are there to be sustainable and to provide to the stakeholders. So that's the employees, that's also to society as a whole, and also when they have an international footprint, to be ensuring that they cover off and that they're paying taxes and employing people locally and helping support the local community and society. And so in the King 4 report, one of the aspects of King 4, which was launched in 2016, required that companies needed to comply or explain. And one of the aspects was that they had to explain what they were doing from an integrated reporting aspect, how they were having an impact on climate, having an impact on society, what they were doing in the local market, but also ensuring that there was transparency. And so we're trying to build, as leaders, confidence. And this time, we're seeing lots of trouble and issues happening because companies are having to downsize. Maybe certain products are no longer viable within the market. So certain sectors within a business or verticals are actually being carved out and removed from the business. And the net effect of that is that employees will lose their jobs, and it will have a societal effect because those individuals may be the sole breadwinners for that particular family. When companies get things wrong, we look at Kodak and Blackberry, and I'm mindful for time. I'm flexible on timing, but we started a few minutes late whilst we waited for more people to join. But we look at Kodak and Blackberry, they are two particular organizations that got it wrong. They had big growth and they had market share, and then various things happened. What happened? They relied on past success. They were mainly focused on their current customers, and just by focusing just on your current customers, you're not having understanding and a pipeline for future growth and development. And so they had a lack of new pipeline of customers. They also failed to adapt to what customers or consumers were looking for. BlackBerry were the main go-to mobile device used by most businesses. I owned several BlackBerries, and I was given a number of BlackBerries during my career, and I enjoyed working with BlackBerry because it was secure, the battery life was very good, and it allowed you to be able to quickly and easily be able to type emails, receive emails, send messages, and other aspects. But one of the things that BlackBerry failed in doing is they didn't look at their wider opportunities of customers and what people were looking for. And so Android and iPhone really took into this space. Before that, BlackBerry were one of the key players. They had, number one, they had very good encryption. Number two, they already had tie-ups with all of the different telecommunication bodies globally, and so the actual network was very good. But they weren't looking at the future pipeline of customers, and they weren't considering what consumers expected and wanted from the device. And so if we look at Generation Z generally don't have a laptop or a desktop. Everything is done through either mobile device or tablet. And so as businesses, we have to adapt based on what our customers and consumers actually want from us. And by doing these failings, Kodak failed to enter the digital side of photography. And so they fell behind the curve, and others stepped in and filled the gap. And so whether Kodak or BlackBerry, lessons can be learned from both of these. Time doesn't allow us to do a deep dive into these particular organizations, but it's very important during crisis and generally businesses, and part of leadership role is about transformation and change management. And so unfortunately, Kodak and BlackBerry were not able to move and embrace change quickly, which takes us to where we are thinking about John Kotter's 8 stages of change. John Kotter talks about how we navigate through to embed change within the corporate culture. And again, corporate culture is very important when it comes to the success of transformation, when we're changing the mindset or the focus or the direction of an organization. But communication is very, very important, and leaders need to be articulate and be able to communicate effectively. And so we think about how this all happens. It's step by step. John Kotter says that we should adopt each of these 8 steps. And I ask you now, what is your plan? What is your next project? What are you working on next? Because as we finish a change and it's embedded, we also have to be, during that process, thinking about other transformational processes. We're seeing business now looking towards IT governance, IT security, IT systems and infrastructure, of going digital and also going remote. This is having an impact and potentially could have major impact. So IT has become very much a strategic player within businesses. This is just a little bit about myself. You can just read that when we do the recording. I'm mindful of time, so I've been very happy to speak to you for the last 45 minutes. And we've got a few more masterclasses, mini masterclasses coming up. The next one will be on the Company Secretaries Guide for high performing boards. Then we'll be looking at some of the aspects of strategic goals and business objectives of being agile. We'll also be looking in the 5th session at enhanced emotional intelligence for more influence, and the role of emotional intelligence over just having simple IQ. And finally, we will end on building an optimal enterprise risk management culture, why this is important, how this ties into governance and also into leadership and oversight. And so that brings us to the final part of our webinar. And I wonder, have we got any questions? Have any of you had any questions? If you've got any questions, you can add them into the chat section here, or feel free to ask the question by audio. Anyone?
Hello, Rob. This is Paul Duval here.
Hi, Paul.
Hi, Rob. Can you hear me okay? Good.
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that's a fascinating insight into leadership. One of the questions I just wanted to raise with you, Rob, was just in terms of what you've seen in leadership. I know you mentioned that you haven't seen a perfect leader, but are there specific instances where you've seen a leader that has really inspired you or inspired the people around them? And if so, what sort of attributes would you say that they really brought to the table?
Great question. Yes, I have seen a number of inspiring and model leaders. Generally, those people are highly intelligent. They are able to think outside of the box, and they are focused on both people and objectives, because objectives are just one aspect when we think about business. A leader has to perform and develop and deliver, but at the same time, it's done through people.